For more on the latest developments in Ukraine, I'm joined in the studio by Anton Fedyashin. He's a history professor at American University, where he's also the executive director at the Initiative for Russian Culture. And thanks for being here. Let's start with this report that there's a new front being opened, Russian soldiers involved. That's the charge from Washington. What do you make of that?
Well, so far, the only proof of Russian soldiers being involved were the 10 Russian soldiers that were detained yesterday. And again, the details are still hazy about that. In addition to that, there's absolutely no firm proof of Russian involvement in this new front, as there hasn't been for the past several months.
What about Yatsenyuk's comments about that the gas is going to be shut off?
Well, Yatsenyuk is making increasingly less sense as time goes on. Although this statement may be in anticipation that the Ukrainians will start siphoning off Russian gas as the winter approaches, because they're heavily in debt to Moscow. They don't have the money to pay for gas. They're wasting it on this war operation against the southeast. And Yatsenyuk's promise that the gas will not get to Europe probably means that the Ukrainians will prevent it from getting there.
I want to get your thoughts, because we had a chance to chat just briefly. You've just come back from Russia,
yes.
and you said it was almost like going to another planet. Just how this is being viewed here in the West and there, how different is it?
Well, it really is black and white. It's strange. I haven't seen anything like this since the worst days of the Cold War in the early 1980s. But the Russians take a profoundly different diametrical reading of this conflict, and the narrative is completely different, which is that this conflict was triggered by the West as a result of a coup d'état, which was illegal and anti-constitutional in Kiev in February, and that the Russians are on the defensive here, and the West is on the offensive, which is exactly the opposite narrative that you hear in the West.
Now, Poroshenko described the talks as very tough and complex. He also talked about this roadmap to peace. And I'm sure, you're talking about being on different planets. I'm sure how Ukraine sees that roadmap is very different from Russia. What type of roadmap do you see that could actually pave the way for peace in the area?
I think ultimately what's going to happen is that the Ukrainian government in Kiev will have to negotiate with the rebels in the southeast. Without that, trying to negotiate directly with Moscow and ignoring their own population, 7 million of them, is going to be very hard to do for Kiev. And ultimately, the victory in this horrible war will not be military. It will have to be socio-economic, because that's what triggered the crisis to begin with, and that's where the negotiations will end up. It's very revealing that at Minsk the other day, the EU, the Ukrainians, and the Russians were represented. In other words, I think the negotiations are going to have to be a tripartite formula, which is exactly what the Russians wanted to happen back in November before this mess started.
Well, isn't that also what Putin said afterwards, that this is not involving Russia, that basically Ukraine's got to fix its own problems?
It has to fix its own problems militarily. Economically, there's no way that this country is going to fix its own problems without the EU and Russia being intimately involved. No one's going to carry Ukraine financially on their own.
What about NATO and their actions of late? I mean, I don't know if you saw the Twitter account of Canada, what they did. They had a tweet saying Ukraine, not Ukraine, and basically poking Russia in the eye about what, the fact that these Russian soldiers ended up in Ukraine.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see what happens at the NATO summit in about a week from today. The chances of NATO actually operating on Ukrainian soil or coming to Ukraine's defense is very slim. All 28 nations would have to agree to it, and there's absolutely no guarantee that this will happen. But NATO is a military organization that has to justify its existence and its budgets, and it's doing so fairly successfully.
Who's the most important figure in terms of ratcheting this down, do you think?
Well, I think ultimately Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, will have to make the toughest decisions, and I don't envy him. Kiev is where all of the most important decisions will have to be made. The Russians, the Europeans, the Americans are sides in this conflict with their own interests, but it's the Ukrainians that will have to fix this mess.
And he's being pulled in a lot of different directions.
In a lot of directions.
Yeah. Anton, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.